They told her to stay back. They told her that horse had already broken 2 men's wrists, shattered a fence post clean in half, and sent a veterinarian running for his truck without looking back. They told her, a widow alone, barely holding her land together, that she had no business going anywhere near that animal. She walked toward him anyway, and what happened in the next 4 minutes changed everything about how every single person on that road would see her for the rest of their lives. Before we get into this story, and I promise you it goes somewhere none of them expected, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated so completely, so publicly, that the moment you proved them wrong felt almost too good to be real? Because that's exactly what this is, and it isn't fiction. This happened on a small ranch in the high plains of Wyoming, in the kind of community where everybody knows your name and everybody thinks they know your limits. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where you're watching from. If you believe quiet people carry the deepest strength, hit that like button before we even begin. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. Now, let me tell you about Maeve Calloway, a horse named Flint, and the day the whole county ran out of words. The town of Harwick Flats, Wyoming, sits at an elevation where the wind never fully stops. It comes off the mountains in the west like it has somewhere important to be, cuts across the open range and hits you in the face with a kind of casual violence that locals have learned to simply accept. You lean into it, you keep your hat low, you move on. Maeve Calloway had been moving on for 3 years. Her husband Gideon had died in the spring of the year she turned 51. A sudden cardiac event, the doctors said, as if putting clinical words around it made the absence smaller. He had been the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice, a rancher, a neighbor, the kind of person who showed up when someone else's fence came down in a storm and didn't wait to be asked. When Gideon died, half the county came to the funeral, the other half sent food, and then, the way life does, everyone returned to their own troubles. Maeve was left with 47 acres, 11 head of cattle, 2 old quarter horses named Biscuit and Pearl, a border collie called Stave, and a mortgage that Gideon had quietly restructured 6 months before his death in a way she was still untangling. She was not a woman who invited pity. She had grown up the 3rd daughter of a dryland wheat farmer in Nebraska, which meant she had learned early that the land did not care about your feelings, only your decisions. She kept the ranch going. Not glamorously, not easily, but going. Her neighbors along the Pelham Road, the men mostly who ran the larger operations flanking her property, respected her in the abstract, the way you respect a fence post. It's there, it's standing, good enough. But they did not, as a rule, consult her. They did not invite her to the informal councils that happened at Prentice Feed and Supply on Saturday mornings, where the real decisions about shared grazing routes and water access got made over bad coffee. They did not ask her opinion. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She noticed. Her closest neighbor was a man named Harwick Ord, no relation to the town despite what he liked to imply, who ran 300 cattle and 24 horses on the land directly north of hers. Harwick was 63, loud in the way only men who've never been told to be quiet can be, and he had strong opinions about everything from federal grazing policy to the correct way to back a trailer. He was not cruel, exactly. He was something more common than cruel. He was dismissive, and dismissal over time lands heavier than any single blow. It was Harwick who had acquired the horse. His name was Flint, and he was a 6-year-old black Andalusian cross that Harwick had bought at auction 9 months earlier from an estate sale in Colorado. The horse had papers. He had a past. Somewhere in that past, something had gone badly wrong. Flint was not simply difficult. Difficult horses are a known quantity. They test you, they challenge you, they require patience and skill and time. Flint was something else. He was reactive in a way that felt almost tactical, like he was always calculating the distance between himself and the nearest exit, always measuring whether the human approaching him was a threat. He didn't kick as a first response. He watched. He waited. And then, if something crossed whatever invisible threshold existed inside him, he erupted with a completeness that left no room for doubt. He had put Harwick's ranch hand, a young man named Tuck, on the ground with a bruised collarbone in the second week. He had sent Harwick himself stumbling backward over a water trough in the fourth week, which resulted in 2 cracked ribs, and a story Harwick told differently every time, depending on the audience. The vet from Casper, a confident man named Corbin, who had worked with difficult animals for 20 years, had come out twice, assessed Flint from a careful distance the second time, and recommended either a specialist or a sale. Harwick had done neither. Instead, he had put Flint in the corner paddock closest to Pelham Road, given him food and water from outside the fence, and essentially declared a cold war. The horse could stay. The horse would not be approached. The horse was, in Harwick's words, delivered to anyone who'd listen at Prentice Feed and Supply, a waste of good Andalusian bloodlines, and an argument for not buying at auction. That was the situation on the Saturday morning in October, when Maeve Calloway stopped her truck on the side of Pelham Road, got out, and walked toward the fence. She hadn't planned it. That's the thing about the moments that change everything. They rarely arrive announced. Maeve had been driving back from the co-op in Harwick Flats with a truckload of winter supplement blocks when she saw Flint standing at the far edge of the paddock, his back to the road, absolutely still in the way that horses are still when something inside them has gone very quiet. She pulled over without fully deciding to. She sat in the truck for a moment, engine idling, looking at him. From the road, he was striking, that deep, almost blue-black coat, the thick neck, the way his tail moved in the constant Wyoming wind with a kind of indifferent elegance. She could see the tension in him, even from 40 feet away. It lived in his hindquarters, in the set of his ears, in the barely perceptible weight shift that happened every time a car passed on the road behind her. He was afraid. That was the thing that everyone else had apparently missed or dismissed or explained away with the simpler story of aggression. Maeve had been around horses since before she could reliably read, and she knew the difference between a horse that wanted to hurt you and a horse that was hurting already. Aggression from cruelty looks like offense. Fear looks like defense. They wear the same face if you're not paying attention. She got out of the truck. She didn't go to the fence right away. She stood by the hood of the truck just inside the shoulder of the road, and she waited, not watching him directly. That matters with a frightened animal, the same way it matters with a frightened person, that you don't pin them with your gaze and force the confrontation. She looked at the mountains. She let the wind push at her jacket. She was simply present, without agenda, without urgency, in the way that her grandmother in Nebraska had once described as giving something room to decide about you. It took about 4 minutes. Flint turned. He didn't come to the fence. He simply repositioned so that one dark eye had a clear line to where she was standing, and he watched her the way a wild thing watches, fully, carefully, making its own calculations. She didn't move toward him. She just turned her head slightly, acknowledged him the way you acknowledge someone across a room, and then looked away again. She stood there for maybe 10 minutes total before she got back in the truck and drove home. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the fourth morning, Harwick Ord's truck came rolling down Pelham Road at 7:15, slowed when he saw her vehicle on the shoulder, and stopped. He rolled down his window. He was a big man, Harwick, wide across the shoulders, with a grey moustache that he seemed to treat as a personal credential. Maeve. He said her name the way men like him say women's names on their own property, like a mild correction. Harwick. She was leaning on the fence post, not touching the fence itself, just near it. "What are you doing out here?" "Watching the morning," she said, which was true enough. He looked at Flint, who was standing 20 feet inside the paddock, closer to the fence than Maeve had seen him yet, ears mobile and uncertain. Then Harwick looked back at her with the expression of a man who has decided to be patient with something he finds slightly ridiculous. "That horse will hurt you," he said. "Already put Tuck down. Would have done worse to me if I hadn't caught the rail." "I know," she said. "He's not a project, Maeve. He's a liability." "Okay," she said. He waited for her to say she'd leave. She didn't say it. He waited another moment, then rolled his window up and drove on, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders through the glass that he had filed this under widow behavior and expected it to resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. Word got around, the way word does in small communities with long winters and strong opinions. By the end of the first week, her daily stops on the shoulder of Pelham Road had become a topic at Prentice Feed and Supply. She heard about it second-hand from her neighbour to the south, a quiet woman named Florrie Oswell, who stopped by with eggs and delivered information the way she delivered everything, gently and completely. "Harwick's saying you're going to get yourself killed," Florrie said, setting the egg carton on Maeve's kitchen counter. Bowen said something similar. "Tuck apparently told someone in town that he hopes you don't get hurt, but that he doesn't think you should be out there. What do you think?" Maeve asked. Florrie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think you know what you're doing," she said finally. "I also think you're going to do it regardless of what anyone thinks." "Both of those are correct," Maeve said. What she didn't say to anyone because it wasn't anyone else's business, was that she hadn't felt this purposeful since before Gideon died, that there was something in Flint's particular combination of damage and dignity that she recognized from the inside, that approaching something frightened and broken and misunderstood and saying, "I'm not here to make demands, I'm just here," felt like the most honest thing she had done in 3 years. She was not trying to tame him. She was not trying to prove anything to Harwick or Bowen or Tuck or anyone at Prentice Feed and Supply. She was just trying to give a scared animal room to decide about her. On day 9, she rested her hand on the fence rail. On day 11, Flint walked to within 6 feet of where she stood. She didn't reach toward him, she just let him be 6 feet away. That night she sat on her porch with stave pressed against her leg and looked at the stars over the mountains and thought about patience, how it isn't weakness, how it isn't waiting, how it is in fact the most active choice a person can make, the decision to stay present inside uncertainty without forcing a conclusion. Gideon had known that. She had forgotten it somewhere in the emergency of grief. She was remembering. By the 3rd week, Harwick had stopped pretending he wasn't watching. He didn't come to the road. That would have required acknowledging that something worth watching was happening, which wasn't a concession he was ready to make. Instead, Maeve noticed his truck parked in the upper lane of his property on 2 separate mornings, far enough back that it was casual, close enough that the angle was deliberate. She ignored this completely, which she understood was its own kind of message. What was changing with Flint was subtle enough that someone looking for drama would have missed it. There was no cinematic breakthrough moment, no single morning when the horse suddenly transformed. What happened was more like watching ice thaw, incremental, quiet, the daily temperature just barely above what it needed to be, and then one day there is water where there was hardness. He had started coming to the fence, not running, not with any visible eagerness. He would be somewhere in the middle of the paddock when she arrived, and then over the course of 20 or 30 minutes, with no apparent connection to anything she was doing, he would simply be closer, and then closer still, until he was at the rail, breathing with that particular slow rhythm that means a horse has decided, provisionally, that the current situation is survivable. She had begun talking to him, not commands. Not the cheerful, coaxing voice people use with animals they're trying to manage. Just talking, the way you talk to someone you're sitting with when the silence has grown comfortable enough that words can move through it without breaking anything. She told him about Gideon, how he used to whistle the same 4 notes every morning while he made coffee, how he had never in 31 years of marriage raised his voice at her, how the absence of him still surprised her sometimes, the way phantom pain surprises people who've had a limb removed. The nerve endings don't get the news right away. She told Flint about the wheat fields in Nebraska, about the smell of August in a place where August means everything, or means ruin. She told him about Biscuit and Pearl, her 2 quarter horses, who were amiable and uncomplicated, and whom she loved the way you love reliable things, steadily and without drama. She wondered sometimes if Flint understood any of it. She thought probably the words didn't matter, the tone mattered, the consistency mattered. She was the same person every morning. She came from the same direction. She stood in the same general spot. She never surprised him. In a world that had apparently given him too many surprises, this seemed to mean something. On day 17, she brought an apple. She didn't offer it immediately. She held it in her jacket pocket for the first 20 minutes, and then when Flint was at the fence, she took it out and held it flat on her palm over the rail. He looked at it for a long time. His nostrils worked. He took a step back. She waited. He took a step forward. She waited. He stretched his neck, that extraordinary Andalusian neck, the architecture of it, and took the apple from her hand with his lips, pulling back before she could have touched him, even if she'd tried. She said quietly, "There you go." And that was the morning that Harwick Ord, watching from his upper lane, drove his truck down to the road for the first time. He pulled up slowly and rolled his window down. Flint, at the sound of the engine, moved back 20 feet in 2 seconds, and Maeve felt something tighten in her chest at the loss of proximity she'd spent 17 mornings building. "I'll thank you not to feed him," Harwick said. He wasn't angry exactly. He was something more complicated than angry. Confused, maybe. Uncertain in a way men like Harwick are not comfortable being. "He took it from my hand," Maeve said. "I can see that. He's not dangerous, Harwick. He's frightened. That horse put Tuck on the ground. Tuck approached him from behind in a stall," she said. "I know because Tuck told Florrie and Florrie told me. A frightened horse approached from behind in an enclosed space will always react. That's not aggression. That's survival." Harwick's mustache moved in a way that meant he was working something over in his head that he hadn't been expecting to work over that morning. "You've handled horses like this before?" he asked. "My father had a draft horse named Creel that spent his first 2 years trying to kill anyone who came near him," she said. "By the time I was 12, he'd carry me bareback across a wheat field." Harwick looked at Flint, who was at the far end of the paddock now, but facing them, watching, always watching. "What happened to Creel?" he asked, and she could tell it was a genuine question, not a challenge. "Old age," she said. 24 years old. Died in the same field." Harwick sat with that for a moment, then he said, "I've got a specialist coming out from Laramie next Tuesday. Booked him 2 months ago and been wondering whether to cancel." "Don't cancel him," she said, "but let me be there." Another pause. Then, "All right." He rolled up his window and drove back up his lane, and Maeve turned back to the paddock. Flint had moved forward again while they were talking. She hadn't noticed. And now he was 15 feet away, watching her with that one dark eye. "You're doing fine," she told him. "Don't let the truck bother you." His ears swiveled. She stayed another 30 minutes, and when she left, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Hopeful. Not in the diffuse, desperate way she'd been hoping since Gideon died, hoping that the mortgage would sort itself, hoping that the winter wouldn't be too hard, hoping in the passive sense, like bracing for a blow. This was active hope, the kind that has evidence. On the drive home, she realized she was whistling, 4 notes, the same 4 notes, and it took her a full mile to understand where she'd heard them before. The specialist from Laramie was a woman. Maeve hadn't known this, and she noted that Harwick had clearly also not known this from the particular way he rearranged his expression when the silver truck pulled up the lane, and a compact woman in her early 40s stepped out carrying a soft-sided bag and a coiled rope halter. Her name was Sarah Voss, Dr. Sarah Voss, equine behavior and rehabilitation, 12 years of practice, and a way of moving around animals that reminded Maeve immediately of water finding its own level. "You must be Mr. Ord," Sarah said, shaking Harwick's hand. Then she turned to Maeve, "And you're the neighbor who's been working with him." Maeve glanced at Harwick, who had apparently communicated this in whatever phone conversation he'd had with Sarah that Maeve knew nothing about. "Just visiting," Maeve said. "Right." Sarah smiled with one side of her mouth. "Let me see him." What happened over the next 2 hours was a clinic in quiet authority. Sarah moved around the perimeter of the paddock with the relaxed confidence that Maeve recognized, that same principle of non-threatening presence, of communicating through the body that you are not a source of danger. She observed. She noted. She spoke to Harwick in the flat, factual tones of someone delivering a diagnosis. Classic fear-based aggression from what I can see. High cortisol baseline, hyper-vigilant posture, strong startle response. Consistent with a horse that was either poorly started, meaning pushed through training stages too quickly, or experienced some significant trauma event. Could be one incident, could be a pattern. Without history, we can't know which. The estate sale came with no history, Harwick said. Estate sales rarely do, Sarah said, not unkindly. Here's what I can tell you. This horse is not broken. He's not dangerous by nature. He's defended, which is a different thing. With the right approach and enough time, I'd expect significant improvement. She turned to Maeve. How has he responded to you? He took an apple from my hand on day 17, Maeve said. Sarah raised her eyebrows. Day 17. She looked at Harwick. That's meaningful progress for an animal this guarded. Harwick's expression had been doing interesting things throughout this conversation. He was a man receiving information that rearranged what he believed, and he was doing it badly. Not from cruelty, but from the specific discomfort of people who've been confident a long time and suddenly find the ground softer than expected. What does the path forward look like? He asked. Sarah outlined it. Consistency, patient desensitization work, no pressure, no forcing, gradual expansion of what Flint was willing to accept. She said it would take months, not weeks. She said it would require someone with time and steadiness and the willingness to accept that progress would not be linear. There was a pause. Harwick looked at Maeve. Maeve waited. Would you be willing to continue working with him? Harwick said finally, and it cost him something. She could see it cost him something to ask. I'll pay you for your time. You don't need to pay me, she said. I want to, he said, and she understood that the payment was not about money. It was about acknowledgement, about converting what had been dismissed as widow behavior into something that had a name and a rate. All right, she said. Sarah scheduled 2 follow-up visits and left a detailed protocol. As she was loading her bag into her truck, she paused and looked at Maeve over the hood. The apple on day 17, she said. That's not luck. That's skill. Maeve drove home through the high plains afternoon, the mountains going gold on the left side of her windshield, and thought about what it meant that a stranger from Laramie had said in 30 seconds what none of her neighbors had managed to say in 3 years. The work continued. She was at Harwick's paddock every morning by 7. Sarah's protocol was precise. Specific distances, specific duration, specific types of engagement. But within the protocol, there was Maeve's particular gift, that quality of stillness, of unhurried presence, of showing up the same way every day and letting the animal decide the pace. Day 22. Flint allowed her to rest her hand on his neck for 3 seconds before stepping back. Day 25, 5 seconds, then 8, then a full minute, her palm flat against his coat, feeling the warmth of him, the incredible warmth that large animals carry, like they've stored summer somewhere deep in them. Day 29. She clipped a lead rope to his halter and walked him in a small circle inside the paddock. He shook his head once. She let the rope go slack. He settled. She told no one about these specific milestones. They felt private, not secret, just hers and his, belonging to the particular trust that was building in that corner paddock the way a structure builds, quietly, one true thing at a time. What she didn't anticipate was that other people were watching. Tuck, who had recovered fully from his collarbone and maintained a cautious relationship with the idea of Flint, had started lingering near the paddock on his way to other morning tasks. He didn't approach. He watched from a distance with the specific expression of a young man who has revised a position and isn't sure how to say so. Bo and Sable, who ran the operation on the other side of Harwick's property and who had been the loudest voice at Prentice Feed and Supply on the subject of Maeve's foolishness, had driven past Pelham Road more frequently than his regular route required. Maeve had noticed the blue pickup slowing. And Harwick himself. Harwick had started coming to the paddock fence in the early mornings before Maeve arrived, just to stand there and look at Flint. She'd seen him twice from the road, arriving early. He didn't acknowledge that she'd seen him. She didn't bring it up. Something was loosening in all of them. She understood that the horse was not only the horse, that what was happening in that corner paddock was a demonstration of something that made people uncomfortable, and then, slowly, less uncomfortable as the evidence accumulated. That patience works. That damage is not destiny. That the loudest assessment of a thing is often the least accurate. She thought about Gideon. He had known this, had lived it. She was learning to live it again without him, which was different and harder, and more hers. November came to the high plains, like it always does, decisively, without nostalgia for October. The mornings dropped below freezing. The wind came down off the mountains with serious intent. Maeve added layers, shifted her timing slightly, and kept coming. She discovered that Flint actually preferred the colder mornings. The heat of summer had made him irritable in ways she now recognized in retrospect, and in the cold he was calmer, more himself, blowing steam and watching her with those dark, measuring eyes. He had begun to meet her at the fence. That was the shift she hadn't seen coming. The morning she pulled off the road and walked toward the paddock, and he was already there, already at the rail, already waiting. She'd stopped walking for a moment, surprised by it, and he tossed his head once, as if to say, "Well, come on." She'd laughed. First real laugh in she couldn't remember how long. Harwick had been standing at the corner of his barn and heard it carry across the frozen air. Later he would describe the sound of it, Maeve laughing in the early morning in the paddock with the horse, as the moment he fully understood that he had been wrong. Not just wrong about Flint. Wrong about all the things he'd quietly assumed about a woman alone on 47 acres with a mortgage and a border collie. He didn't tell her this for several more weeks. He said it eventually in Harwick's particular way, circuitously, dressed in practical language, embedded in a conversation about something else. But he said it. The conversation at Prentice Feed and Supply had shifted. Maeve knew this from Florrie, who had become something of an informal correspondent on community opinion. The narrative had evolved from the widows going to get hurt to a more uncomfortable silence on that subject, and then to something that Florrie described accurately as grudging fascination. "Bowen asked me if she'd considered taking on other horses," Florrie reported over the kitchen counter one morning, setting down a jar of preserved plums. "Difficult ones. He apparently has a friend in Gillette with a problem mare." "Bowen said that?" Maeve said. "His exact words were, 'You have to admit she's got a gift for it,' which from Bowen is approximately equivalent to a standing ovation." Maeve put the plums in the pantry and thought about that. She hadn't considered it. She had thought of this, all of this, as being about Flint specifically, about this particular animal's particular damage and the particular kind of attention it required. She hadn't thought past it. But Sarah Voss had said something on her second visit that was starting to surface more frequently in Maeve's mind. They'd been standing at the paddock fence watching Flint walk calmly in a circle on the lead. A calm circle, relaxed and forward-moving, a sight that 6 weeks earlier would have been unimaginable. And Sarah had said, "You know, what you do naturally with animals in this state is something most people spend years trying to learn. Some of them never do." "My father's horses," Maeve had said, the usual deflection. "No," Sarah had said, quietly firm. "You. What you did with this horse came from you." The thing about being genuinely seen, truly recognized, after years of being overlooked, is that it doesn't feel the way you expect. You expect triumph. What you get is something quieter and more complicated, a kind of grief for the time during which you weren't seen. And underneath the grief, something steadier, a foundation. Maeve was standing on it now. She could feel it underfoot. On the 40th day, she rode Flint. That's not quite accurate. She didn't ride him in any formal sense. She led him to the fence rail, stood on the lower rung, and leaned her body across his back for 30 seconds. That was all. She didn't swing her leg over. She just let him feel her weight, let him register that this was possible, that a person on his back was not an emergency. He stood perfectly still. She climbed down. She pressed her forehead against his neck and stayed there for a moment, breathing. His breath came out in slow steam. His ear turned back toward her. "Good," she said. "That's very good." Tuck had been watching from the far end of the paddock. Howick had started allowing him to observe from a respectful distance, partly as training and partly because Tuck had asked. He was leaning on a fence post with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back, and when Maeve straightened up and caught his eye, he just nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something he'd needed confirmed. She nodded back. The dynamic at Howick's operation had shifted so completely by this point that it had become almost unremarkable. Maeve arriving in the morning as a matter of course, Tuck and sometimes Howick observing, Flint meeting her at the fence, the whole enterprise feeling less like a social experiment and more like simply what happened, the way necessary things eventually normalize. But Maeve knew the community conversation hadn't fully resolved. Grudging fascination was not the same as respect. Changed behavior wasn't the same as understanding, and she knew, because this is how these things work, that there would be a moment, a public moment, the kind that happens in small communities whether you arrange them or not, when the accumulated evidence would have to declare itself. She didn't arrange it. It arranged itself, the way necessary things do, on a Saturday in late November. The morning of the Pelham Road Winter Potluck, which Howick hosted every year in his largest barn, and which the entire surrounding ranching community attended, the morning of that day, when 20 people would be arriving by midday with food and news, and the particular social energy of neighbors coming in from the cold for the first time in weeks. That morning, Maeve arrived at the paddock at 7, and Howick Ord was standing at the fence, and Bowen Sable's blue truck was parked on the road, and Tuck was there, and she stopped walking for just a second. Florrie was there, and next to Florrie were 2 other women from neighboring properties, whose names Maeve knew, but who had never before found their way to this particular corner of Pelham Road. Everyone was looking at the paddock. Flint was standing at the fence, waiting. She walked through the assembled small crowd the way she walked every morning, not performing, not acknowledging the audience, simply going where she was going. She heard Howick say something quiet to Bowen that she didn't catch, and then she was at the fence, and Flint pressed his nose against her jacket shoulder in greeting, which he had started doing a week ago, and which still, every single time, stopped her breath for a second. "Morning," she said to him. "Morning," said someone in the small crowd behind her, and a quiet laugh moved through them. She worked through the routine she'd established, the approach, the contact, the lead rope. She walked him in the paddock with the same unhurried competence she'd been building for 41 days. She noticed peripherally that no one spoke, that they were watching with the specific attention people give things they don't fully understand but recognize as real. Then she walked Flint to the fence rail. She had not planned to do what she did next, or perhaps she had planned it without knowing she'd planned it, the way you sometimes discover a decision you've already made when the moment arrives to act on it. She stepped up on the fence rail. She leaned across his back, the way she'd done 10 days ago. She felt him settle beneath her. Not tense, not bracing, but settling, accepting. She waited. Then she swung her leg over. She sat on his back, both legs down, and she held the lead rope loosely, not gripping, not directing, just connected. And Flint stood. He stood the way a horse stands when it has arrived somewhere, not as a performance, not as surrender, but as a choice. No one behind her made a sound. After a long moment, she pressed very gently with her calves. Flint walked forward, slowly, straight, ears forward, completely calm. She turned him in a wide arc around the paddock, not a full ride, not a controlled work session, just a walk. A single, wide, gentle loop around the space where 6 weeks ago a man had been put on the ground and a veterinarian had retreated to his truck. When she came back to the fence and stopped, she sat still for a moment longer than necessary. She could feel the warmth of him under her, the rise and fall of his breath, the incredible aliveness of a large animal that has decided to trust you. Then she dismounted, unclipped the lead, and scratched him between his ears the way he liked, firmly, 2 fingers, just at the pole. She turned around. Every person standing at the fence had a different expression, but they all shared the same quality, the look of people who have witnessed something they cannot immediately find words for. Harik Ord looked like a man reconsidering a map. Bowen Sable looked like a man who had been certain of something, and now was not certain of it anymore, and was deciding how to feel about that. Tuck looked like a 24-year-old who has just learned something that will stay with him for the rest of his life and knows it. Florrie looked quietly and without fanfare, proud. It was Harwick who spoke first. He cleared his throat, the masculine preparation for something that costs something. "Maeve," he said. "Harwick," she said. A pause. "I've been telling people you were going to get hurt." "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said, flat and direct, the way honest men say hard things when they've finally committed to saying them. "Yes," she said, not gently, not triumphantly, just confirming. "I've also been—" He stopped, started again. "I've been running the Saturday coffee the wrong way." He didn't explain what he meant by this, and he didn't need to. Everyone there understood that Saturday coffee at Prentice Feed and Supply had its own particular kind of door that had been quietly and consistently left less than open to the woman standing in front of them. "Water rights meeting in December," Bowen said suddenly, not quite looking at Maeve. "We're doing it at the feed store. You should be there." Maeve looked at him for a moment. "I own 47 acres on the tributary line," she said. "I probably should have been there before." Bowen's jaw moved. "Yeah," he said, "probably. It wasn't a full reckoning. Communities don't do full reckonings in single scenes. They do them incrementally, the way trust builds, the way ice thaws. But it was real. It was the beginning of a real thing, which is always more valuable than a dramatic gesture that doesn't last." Florrie stepped forward and hugged her, which surprised Maeve, and then it didn't surprise her, and she leaned into it briefly with the gratitude of someone who has been carrying something alone and is now slightly less alone. They all went to the potluck. It was not transformed. Harwick was still loud, Bowen was still opinionated, the barn was still cold and smelled of hay and cattle and the particular community warmth of people who survive hard winters together. But Maeve sat at the long table, and someone passed her food, and someone asked her a question, and she answered, and someone responded, and she was simply part of the conversation in a way she had not been before. Flint was in his paddock outside, in the cold, facing the barn. She checked him on her way out, late in the afternoon, the sun going orange over the mountains. She stood at the fence, and he came to her, and she scratched him at the pole, and he leaned into it with the comfortable weight of an animal that has located, finally, a place that feels safe. "You did good today," she told him. He breathed out a slow gust of warm air. The mountains went from orange to purple to the dark blue of a Wyoming evening that is coming on fast. She drove home. December was cold and clear, the way Wyoming Decembers sometimes are. All hard light and frozen air and sky so blue it hurt. Maeve attended the water rights meeting at Prentice Feed and Supply and said exactly 6 things, all of them relevant. All of them derived from 47 acres of direct knowledge about the tributary line that no one in that room had previously thought to access. By the end of the meeting, 2 decisions had been changed. One of them saved her approximately $400 in the following spring's water allocation costs. She bought Flint. Harik had come to her about it, which was its own kind of significant. He'd shown up at her door on a Tuesday with his hat in his hands, not literally, but very nearly literally, and said that Flint was making real progress and he thought the horse belonged with the person who'd done the work, and that if she was willing to take on the liability transfer, he would price it at what he'd paid at auction. She'd asked Sarah Voss's opinion. Sarah had said, "I'd be surprised if you said no." She signed the paperwork in Harwick's kitchen, and they shook hands across his table, and Harwick's wife, a quiet woman named Linnae, who had been present through all of this from her window and her porch and her particular marital vantage point, brought out coffee and said, "I'm glad it worked out," with a warmth that meant considerably more than the words. Flint came to Maeve's property in the first week of December. She had prepared the paddock adjacent to Biscuit and Pearls, close enough for company, separated enough for adjustment. Biscuit investigated immediately and thoroughly. Pearl watched from a distance with her characteristic caution, and then, within 20 minutes, went back to her hay. Flint walked the perimeter of his new space, and then stood at the center and looked at Maeve's house. She was watching from the porch. Stave was pressed against her leg. "This is home," she told him, even though he was 80 feet away. He turned his head toward her voice. Tuck drove out twice in the first month, officially for other reasons, and each time ended up at the fence, watching Flint move in his paddock with the expression of a young man, filing something important. On his second visit, he asked Maeve a specific question about approaching a fearful horse, the mechanics of it, the body language, what to do with your eyes. She told him. He listened the way people listen when they're actually learning, and she recognized in his attention the thing that makes teaching meaningful, the sense that the knowledge will go somewhere real, will move through this person and into their work and their hands and become part of how they treat the animals in their care for the rest of their lives. She thought about Sarah Voss saying, "What you do naturally is something most people spend years trying to learn." She thought about Bowen's friend in Gillette with the problem mare. She hadn't decided anything yet. She was letting the idea move around in her, the way you let a possibility exist before you force it into a plan. But she was letting it move. Spring was coming. In Wyoming, spring doesn't come easy. It argues with winter for weeks, and winter doesn't concede without a fight. But it comes. It always comes. And with it, the mud and the green and the specific hopefulness of a place that has survived another winter and knows what that means. Maeve stood on her porch in the late December light and looked at her land. 47 acres, 11 head of cattle, 2 old quarter horses, 1 Andalusian cross with a difficult past and a quiet present, 1 mortgage that was sorting itself, 1 border collie breathing slow against her leg, 4 notes, whistled without thinking, rising into the cold air. The story of Maeve Calloway and the violent horse circulated through the Harwick Flats community in the way that true stories circulate in small places, not as gossip exactly, but as something closer to oral record, the community telling itself something about itself that it needs to remember. Bowen told the story to his friend in Gillette, and that friend called Maeve in February. The mare's name was Rosette, a 6-year-old grey quarter horse with a history as opaque as Flint's and a defensive aggression that had made her unusable by every measure of the people around her. Maeve drove to Gillette on a Thursday. She stood at the fence of a paddock in a different county and watched a grey horse watch her from the far end. And she felt the same thing she'd felt the first morning she stopped on Pelham Road. That quality of recognition, one wounded thing recognizing another. She said yes. Rosette came to the property in March, in the last snow of winter, and was installed in the paddock on the far side of Biscuit and Pearls. Flint watched her arrival with a calm attention that Maeve found moving. This horse, who had been so defended, observing a new arrival with patience rather than alarm. "You're teaching by example," she told him. His ear turned. That was enough. Sarah Voss came out in April and watched Maeve work with Rosette for 40 minutes. She didn't say anything during. Afterward, she sat on the porch with Maeve and Stave and a cup of coffee that Maeve's particular percolator made better than it had any right to. And she was quiet for a moment in the good way. The way of someone deciding how to say something she means. "Have you considered doing this formally?" she asked. "I'm a rancher," Maeve said. "You're also this," Sarah said. She said it plainly, without drama. Maeve looked at her land. 47 acres. 2 horses in rehabilitation, 2 horses in comfort, 11 cattle who required her steady presence, 1 dog who gave it in return, a mortgage that had become manageable, a water rights committee that now routinely asked her opinion, neighbors who arrived at her fence and then, eventually, her door. "I'll think about it," she said. She is still thinking about it, which in Maeve's particular language is very nearly yes. Flint is, by every measure available, a different horse from the one that went in that corner paddock. He is not a simple horse. He will never be a simple horse, any more than people who have survived significant damage become simple people. He carries his history. It is visible in the way his attention sharpens at sudden sounds, in the way he prefers to see the approach from a distance, in the particular vigilance that never entirely leaves him. But he is present. He is willing. He meets Maeve at the fence every morning. He carries her on trails she'd stopped riding after Gideon died, out along the high ridgeline west of the property, where in summer you can see 4 counties in every direction, and the mountains look permanent in the way that very few things are permanent. She rides him with a loose rein, and he moves with a willingness that is the opposite of resignation. It is chosen, deliberate, a continuous daily yes offered by an animal that had to learn trust the hardest way, from the complete absence of it. There is a morning she returns to, sometimes, in her own mind. The morning she pulled off Pelham Road the first time and sat in the truck watching a black horse stand at the far edge of a paddock with his back to everything. She'd seen something in him that no one else had seen, or no one had paused long enough to see, which amounts to the same thing. What she saw was not potential exactly, not the optimistic version, "this horse could be great," that leads people to push too hard and break things further. What she saw was simpler and more important. She saw that he was still here, still showing up, still surviving, still standing in the cold Wyoming morning, despite everything that had led to that paddock. And she understood that about him because she understood it about herself. That showing up is not nothing, that it is sometimes the whole thing. Gideon had known that. She is learning to know it on her own terms. Every morning, the fence, the horse, the 4 notes whistled into the cold air. Every morning enough. There's something this story keeps asking me. Not about horses, or not only about horses. It keeps asking what we decide about people when we see them facing something hard and unfamiliar, and whether we see struggle as incompetence or as evidence of courage, and how often those 2 readings share the same face. Maeve walked toward the thing everyone told her to walk away from, not because she was reckless, because she was paying a different kind of attention than the people around her. And that's the thing, isn't it? The people who told her to stay back weren't wrong about the danger. They were wrong about her. They looked at a widow on a small piece of land and calculated her limits from the outside, without asking what she knew, what she'd carried, what her hands were capable of. The horse looked at her and decided something different. I think about that a lot, about who we let assess us, about whose reading of our limits we accept, about all the mornings where the decision to show up, simply to show up and stay consistent and patient and present, was the bravest thing a person could have done. Maeve didn't make a speech. She didn't win an argument. She walked toward a fence, and she kept walking toward it until the evidence was undeniable. That's it. That's the whole instruction. If this story stayed with you, if it landed somewhere that matters, leave it in the comments. Tell me what it made you think about. Tell me your city. Tell me what you're walking toward that other people don't understand yet. Like the video, if you believe quiet people carry the deepest strength. Subscribe if you want more stories that take the long view on what people are capable of. And wherever you are, whether you're in Harwick Flats or somewhere the wind comes at you from a completely different direction, keep showing up. That's enough. It's always been enough. See you in the next one.